The NES makes like Laura Branigan and takes your self-control on NES Works episode 110.
You know what I mean? Let's do the wild thing.
NES home ports of vintage Golden Age arcade titles have become something of a rarity as the system has come into its own and begun to express its own original creations. But for some reason, Konami decided to enter 1989 under the guise of Ultra Games with 2 games from the classic days of the arcade.
The first of these, Q Bert, is the more iconic work of the 2. Back during the initial 1980s video game boom, where the hits were heavily character-driven, Q Bert stood out as one of the major hits. Now, I don't know how well the game itself performed in arcades, but its eponymous protagonist became one of the best-loved video game heroes of the era. Q Bert earned the rare distinction of a cartoon spin-off as part of CBS's Saturday Supercade programming block. The cartoon's creators inexplicably looked at the game, which involved a weird-looking orange guy hopping around a multicolored pyramid, and said, this would be a perfect property for a 1950s youth culture homage. It's a weird creative choice. The best I can figure is that the game's setting, an endless succession of colorful pyramids, vaguely reminded someone of the black and white checkered floor tiles of diners in the 50s. This then translated into a bizarre hybrid of Happy Days and the Flintstones. Who knows? In any case, Saturday Supercade speaks to Q Bert's popularity, and what's not to like? The game has surreal aesthetics, but they land somewhere between the red-hot Rubik's Cube fad of the early 80s and the work of the perennially popular MC Escher. Add to that some easily accessible, but incredibly difficult gameplay, a bunch of weird characters led by a sweary, round orange guy with 2 spindly legs and a massively oversized nose, and you have a game that is just strange enough to be appealing to a wide audience. Even Iggy girls, who used to go to arcades before everyone decided video games should only be for boys. Q Bert, the game, has a simple enough design that the NES has no trouble whatsoever replicating its gameplay. I mean, the Atari 2600 and Othello Multivision had handled it with aplomb, so if Konami had dropped the ball here, it would have been pretty embarrassing. But of course, Konami had some experience with the series, having distributed the game in Japanese arcades, and potentially having been involved with the licensing of the Othello Multivision version. Gameplay consists of nothing more than jumping around. No shooting, no special gimmicks, and only a handful of factors that could be considered power-ups. Main character Q Bert leaps around a pyramid of cubes, and each time he lands on a cube's upper surface, it changes color. Your goal then is to hop across the entire pyramid, changing the entire structure to a single target color. This task proves quite daunting due to the hazardous factors at work. Like if you hop off the sides of the pyramid, you'll die. If you collide with one of the red balls or purple monsters hopping around the pyramid, you die. The unorthodox movement, or rather the unorthogonal movement, forces you to think about space differently in order to avoid your pursuers, especially once Ugg and Wrongway appear and leap across the forward faces of the pyramid's cubes rather than the upper faces that Q Bert and Coily occupy, but who can still end your game by smashing into you. In the second set of stages, Q Bert needs to hop on cubes multiple times to switch their colors, and in level 3 you need to contend with the fact that hopping on a cube repeatedly will cause its color to toggle back and forth between its target color and its starting color. Worse, a little annoying guy named Sam starts to appear and will reset the color of any cube he lands on. Q Bert is hard enough at its most basic level, but trying to dodge enemies while managing more complex color mechanics can be downright infuriating. And the NES version conveys all of this pretty effectively. Still, this take on Q Bert doesn't quite 100% work for me, because it looks and feels a little off. The sprite for the leading man, or leading whatever the heck Q Bert is meant to be, lacks the detail of his arcade sprite, with a heavy black outline rather than volumetric shading. This was a pretty universal failing of Q Bert home conversions. Little guy, gal being of indeterminate nature proved surprisingly difficult to render on consoles. The NES had the resolution, the sprite color capabilities, and the palette depth to render a proper Q Bert, but nevertheless he looks small and flat here. Worse, his nose appears unfortunately, flaccid. I'm afraid Q Bert is not happy to see you. The enemy sprites appear similarly diminished. I suppose some compromise was inevitable here, given the vertical arrangement of the coin-op's cabinet monitor, an issue that anyone familiar with classic arcade-to-home conversions will be familiar with. But the choice diminishes the game. I realize this is nitpicky complaining, but Q Bert is a classic, and its appeal largely revolved around its outlandish characters. I would have expected Konami to nail the characters here, but they missed. Another, more inevitable issue arises from the fact that the gameplay in Q Bert works entirely on diagonals, to the point that its joystick was mounted into a 4-way restricted gate installed at a 45-degree offset in arcades to allow players to easily leap from cube face to cube face with full confidence. The NES, of course, standardized the 4-directional D-pad controller concept, a massive boon for most games, but alas, not for Q Bert. The company did program an entire special introductory screen that allows you to define your control setup so that you can sign the character's diagonal movements to either a single cardinal direction or to a dual tap of 2 directions at once. Neither of these works especially well on the D-pad, making this a game that really begs for the NES Advantage, or the NES Max if you're one of those weirdos. I can see the appeal of Q Bert for players in 1989. It was one of those instantly recognizable arcade classics whose absence in the post-crash American console market allowed it to slip from this again to, hey, I remember that one. But today, knowing that this was a Konami joint and that Ultra was just a shell, I think it's fair to expect better. Konami treated home conversions of their own properties with ebullient love and care, but it seems that when it came to translating others' creations to NES, they were happy to cash their paycheck and call it a day. This habit seems especially egregious here, since Q Bert arrived alongside a Konami conversion of a Konami game from the same era as Q Bert.
Now see, this is more like what you'd expect from Konami. Gyruss may be a dated, old video game, poorly suited for the NES, but Konami decided to rebuild the entire thing from top to bottom and give it a real spit and polish shine for NES.
In arcades, Gyruss more or less amounted to Tempest, with Galaga's enemy formations and Bach music, which is a pretty awesome combo, and it would make for a decent enough home conversion in its own right, albeit a dated one. But no, Konami didn't settle for decent enough here. They gave Gyruss a full-on makeover. The game loses both its vertical screen orientation and the spinner controls, more on that in a moment, but it keeps the arcade title's core premise of fighting through waves of enemies while warping from the outskirts of the solar system to the sun. And it gains plenty, including new mechanics, new stages, new visuals, new enemy patterns, and even bosses. It also maintains the arcade version's immense difficulty level. Gyruss gives you 3 lives and no continues with which to clear about 3 dozen stages, and it pulls no punches. Well, okay, it pulls its punches a little bit. In the spirit of Contra and Life Force, this port of Gyruss includes a 30 lives code, though not, it should be noted, the 30 lives code from Contra and Life Force. Nevertheless, even with the boost, you'll be hard-pressed to complete Gyruss for NES. It's unflinchingly difficult, with nasty enemy patterns and tons of objects to avoid. The bosses alone can whittle down your life count to a bloody stump, and that's not even including the thousands of foes you face across dozens of standard stages. The game comes by most of that difficulty fairly, but not actually all of it. For starters, I questioned the aesthetic choice that resulted in enemy projectiles appearing with the same color palette as the enemies that launched them. Contra and the Gradius family did a great job of highlighting dangerous objects by displaying them either in white or with a palette cycling rainbow effect. Here, however, blue enemies fire blue projectiles, red enemies fire red projectiles, and they often do so while clustered together in a huge messy mass that makes it almost impossible to recognize the fact that they've fired a projectile in the first place until it's too late to dodge them. Which brings us to the other facet of Gyruss's elevated difficulty on NES, the act of dodging, or in fact the act of moving at all. In arcades, Gyruss used a spinner controller, just like its very obvious inspiration, Tempest. Now, the NES had a dial controller as of ARKANOID in late 1987, but because that wasn't a Nintendo-produced peripheral and was packed with a single third-party game, the mouse paddle was never supported by any game besides ARKANOID. It probably wouldn't have been a perfect match for Gyruss anyway, since the mouse dial didn't offer free spinning, but instead only rotated far enough to allow the on-screen mouse to travel from one edge of the screen to the other. Still, it would have been better than what we actually did get here. Gyruss offers 2 different control schemes, neither of which is quite perfect. Option 1 sets the controls relative to the ship's visual orientation, causing the ship to rotate left or right from the player's perspective when the player presses the D-pad in one of those directions. This approach would actually work really well if not for the fact that the designers programmed a hard barrier at the middle of each side of the screen. When you use this relative control scheme, you rotate until you hit the midpoint of the virtual tube at the left or right of the screen, at which point you come to a dead stop. This is a weird, bad choice. It destroys any sense of smooth flow to the gameplay by causing you to come crashing to a halt halfway up the screen and forcing you to press the opposite direction in order to continue rotating. The scheme would work flawlessly if the ship simply continued to rotate in the direction you pressed until you released the D-pad, then reoriented the function of the controls. That's a perfectly normal and perfectly effective way of handling things. For those who find this awkward limitation frustrating, Gyruss does offer a second control scheme. In Control Style 2, pressing left always sets you spinning clockwise, while pressing right always rotates you counterclockwise. This is almost, but not quite, how spinners work. I mean, you turn the spinner in one direction, your ship rotates the same way. But the obvious difference here is that a D-pad does not spin, which means that once you pass that midway point along the edges of the screen, the direction you press is opposite the one you want your ship to move in. You can learn to deal with either of these systems with time and patience, but that's the thing. They require time and patience, where the appeal of games like this in arcades is the intuitive responsive feel of the controls. Ah well. To make up for these defects, Konami decided to make everything else about Gyruss kick ass. If the arcade game looked like a cross between Tempest and Galaga spiced up with Bach, the NES version stands apart from any other adaptation by looking like a cross between Tempest and Galaga spiced up with a style of Contra and Life Force. This is one of those cases where the phrase, "they didn't have to go this hard," truly applies. The game moves with the same speed and fluidity as the arcade version, but it arguably looks better here. Maybe the sprites have less color depth and shading, but they look more detailed and possess greater visual variety. They scale well, and they offer more gameplay variety, combining some truly creative patterns and mechanics. In addition to the usual swarms of foes flying around in circles, you also have to deal with enemies that trace your patterns, split when hit, soak up multiple shots, and recoil out of the way when struck, or launch fireballs at you. And the bosses. Who would have thought a tube shooter could have such inventive and challenging bosses back in 1989? These range from a recurring boss that reappears with more complex patterns every so often, to the dizzying final foe, which, in true Konami shooter style, eventually reveals itself to be a giant space brain. The one thing they have in common is the fact that they will absolutely ruin your day the first time you encounter them, catching you totally off guard and forcing you to manage some tricky and often cruel patterns and behaviors. I wish Gyruss had a slightly better control scheme for NES, because the interface options are the one thing that keep it from achieving true masterpiece status. But even if it's not a masterpiece, it is at least a master class in transforming an aging arcade title into a top-notch NES game that holds its own against games of a later era of design and expectations. It's a shame that this would be the last of Konami's, Ultra's, NES conversions of vintage arcade releases. One could only imagine what they might have done with Rock and Rope, Tutankhamun, or Time Pilot if they had given them a similar treatment to Gyruss. Alas, we had to make do with the Konami output we did get. Oh, and what did Nintendo Power say? Pretty much exactly nothing.
Next time on NES Works, Konami delivers another great arcade to console conversion.